Welcome back everyone, it's Crazy Welder, and in today's video I'm going to be going over some rather interesting news coming from both the Nvidia and Nintendo camp as well as the Xbox side of things too. Now, the first topic is going to be one that I feel like a lot of people are probably going to flame me on or disagree on, what have you. But that is the fact that Nvidia just recently announced their TI lineup for the 3000 series of their GPUs. Now, most people, when looking at this, are probably pretty stoked. They're excited, we're finally getting more memory in these graphics cards like they were really supposed to be at launch. We're getting faster memory speeds as well, which now also means that the 3080 is going to be performing much closer to the 3090, potentially even exceeding it, and the 3070 again being able to actually close the gap to AMD's more recent lineup of the 6000 series, especially in 4K rendering, where otherwise, especially on games that are a little bit more texture heavy, the amount of VRAM on that card slowed it down, potentially causing stutters. So again, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why are you saying that this isn't really such a great thing? And the reason I'm saying that this announcement is pretty much completely pointless is because, quite simply, most of you, and probably me, are not going to be able to get our hands on these cards. And this is really a big problem, because what is the point of building the hype when you can pretty much be guaranteed that just about nobody is going to be able to get their hands on these cards? Most gamers are going to end up with their hands empty just because, once again, if the trends as they are continue, we're going to see scalping happen yet again. We're going to see miners pick these cards up, as has been proven that you can use drivers or defeat Nvidia's drivers to keep continuing to mine at pretty good rates. And we're also going to still see a lot of demand because there are still a lot of people that haven't gotten their 3000 or 6000 series AMD cards in this case. So this whole announcement, while it's great to see that there is progress being made, that we're getting higher tier versions of these Nvidia products, at the end of the day, given the way that things have been going, the announcement is pretty much completely moot. It doesn't matter how much power these cards have or don't have, when in fact most users are simply not going to be able to get them in their rigs. They're not going to be able to run them, which means all we're really going to see is benchmark results from, somebody like Linus Tech Tips, from Hardware Unboxed, all these other vendors that, constantly get this new supply directly from companies like Nvidia and AMD. And in this particular case, it's just simply going to be impossible if the trends continue. Now, of course, this may also kind of depend on where we land in terms of the foundries getting back into shape and making sure that these products are getting back on track. But as it stands, we're looking at potentially another year before the foundries recover, which makes me truly wonder how it is that Nvidia is planning on having these cards get into the gamers' hands. Now, of course, there are going to be probably some vendors that, like EVGA, will allow you to basically pre-select a queue spot so that you can get the card as soon as it's available without having to pay a ridiculous price, an exorbitant price. But with that said, again, at this point in time, given the trend of how things are going, you're most likely not going to be able to buy these in MSRP. You're going to get scalped. They're most likely going to be unavailable immediately because, once again, people are going to use bots. And even if you use a bot yourself, there's really a very slight chance that you might be able to get this card, making this whole thing pretty much a dud. Now, that's not to say that everything's completely bad across the board. There's been a very interesting development from the Nvidia side of things on the Nintendo Switch, and this specifically comes in the form of what is supposed to be the Switch Pro, newer version of the Switch, which is now going to be going to a really nice OLED screen, amongst other things. But the biggest update that they're actually sharing with us now is that over the docked version of the Switch, meaning when it's in docked mode, you're going to be able to push 4K via DLSS. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, but DLSS has been around for a while, why is it going to be such a big deal on the Switch? And the reason why this makes a huge improvement for us, in addition to some of the other specs that I'll sort of talk around in a little bit here, is that DLSS has been improving quite significantly. Now, if you've been somebody who's owned or used an Nvidia Shield before, then you already know that the Nvidia Shield has a good number of AI upscaling options available on it that you can tweak depending on the kind of TV show you're watching, and those allow you to make some pretty good image quality improvements to what you're seeing, effectively making something like 1080p look a little bit more like 4K and making 720p look a little bit more like 1080p. Now, this, of course, is a very limited kind of algorithm because there's not an actual type of hardware within the basically Nvidia Shield setup that allows you to do this. Now, on this Switch, they're actually promising some sort of Turing cores that are going to be doing this, essentially meaning that all of the learnings that they've had from their PC platform and various other platforms where this has been deployed, they're going to be able to take those neural net analytics and all that stuff that they've gained from running all these games, etc., on different levels of hardware and so on and so forth, and apply it on the Switch, meaning that your visual fidelity is going to be a really nice big jump. Now, this, of course, also means that what previously used to be just a really, really low-end looking port, so for example, if you take a look at something like The Witcher 3, where the Nintendo Switch quite frequently has to struggle to hit 720p, and in most frequent cases ends up dropping down below that, especially when it's undocked, making the image rather blurry. And so for a especially big open world title like this, you're going to see a massive improvement in the quality now because they're going to be able to run the game at a very small native resolution and then essentially upscale that up using essentially what you could see as like Nvidia Super Resolution on the PC, where you take your regular resolution, whatever it is for your screen, you bump that up, but then downscale it back again so that it fits the actual number of pixels that are on your screen. Same basic kind of setup here, except it is going to be going down to the resolution of the Switch OLED, which I think at this point is still slated to be 720p, but feel free to correct me on that if I'm wrong. Now, it does seem like at this stage that this is still in early talks. They are planning on also making the CPU just that much faster, so we're going to see a nice jump in terms of the performance with the Switch across the board. Now, the graphics capabilities, we'll see what comes out of that in terms of the overall setup and what sort of SoC they're going to end up using, because right now it's still, a lot of it's kind of up in the air, but I would imagine that it's Nvidia's newer generation of hardware that they'll be rolling out, which essentially means that some titles are probably not going to be backwards compatible, but we'll see once that actually hits the final production unit, and we'll be able to do some comparisons. Now, the other interesting part here is that now that the Switch is getting this upgrade, we're going to see a lot more parity with it, and consoles such as the PS4 Pro, and I would imagine Xbox One X. I don't think it is going to be able to achieve Xbox One S or X series performance, and I don't think it's going to approach the PS5, but with that said, what we're going to see specifically on the Xbox Series S side is that since AMD is introducing their Super Resolution or high fidelity technology, which is supposed to combat DLSS in that same kind of space, it is likely that we're going to be able to see head-to-head comparisons of games that are multi-platform running on the Switch at upscaled 4K via DLSS, and also the same game running on the Series S hardware using an AMD solution, which is going to be analogous to what Nvidia has, save for the fact that AMD is not going to be using AI models. Now, this is something which is kind of an interesting part, because I think potentially while AMD is trying to bring this to the consoles as well as PC at the same time, it's definitely a big deal, and I think we'll be seeing now that developers will most likely are still console-centric, are going to start bringing this into their PC ports as well, as I would imagine the development teams will be fairly similar and they'll have a lot of cross-comm between them in terms of bringing these features in, which means potentially PC titles will see head-to-head comparisons of DLSS and AMD's resolution technology, which will be essentially like a modified FidelityFX that'll now be running this stuff in the background. But they may be shooting themselves in the foot just a little bit, because while Nvidia is able to run through multiple training sets, essentially improving their technology as they go, AMD is kind of stuck using a singular algorithm, although this may be proven false at some point later on. But I think it also means there's going to be a lot more R&D cost that AMD is going to have to throw at this to be able to compete at the same level as Nvidia, and most likely what we're going to see is sort of the same effect we've been seeing with AMD's ray tracing implementation, where it'll take them a number of driver revisions before they're able to start slowly catching up to the same quality that Nvidia has had. Now, of course, the AMD head is saying that this project is approaching Nvidia levels and they're getting great results from it, but it's too early to tell for now until we see those actually happen. And the last bit of news, which I think is rather interesting, although again, another technology that is now being ported from consoles to PC, which is typically the other way around, is basically Microsoft's HDR implementation. Now, those of you who have been following the Xbox Series S and X launches, you'll know that those consoles are capable of basically applying HDR to the titles that do not typically have this feature enabled, again enriching the amount of colors that you're seeing on the screen, and if you have an HDR capable TV, essentially just giving the image that nice presentation that you expect from AAA releases nowadays. But this is kind of interesting to me because they're seemingly doing this at an OS level, meaning that once you receive this Windows update that has HDR built in, presumably you'll be able to toggle this on and off as you please, working across a multitude of titles. But at this stage, I would imagine only DirectX 12 titles will be supported. I'm not sure if that's going to be backwards compatible to DirectX 11, for example, and I'm not sure how well this is going to work with Vulkan, because I'm assuming that the DirectX implementation being used is basically DirectX ray tracing, not Vulkan specific ray tracing, which would be a different pipeline entirely. But again, we'll just have to kind of wait and see. The cool thing about this is that if you look at the Steam hardware surveys, a lot of you guys nowadays who are PC gamers are on 1440p panels, and a slightly smaller chunk of that is also having HDR supported panels, although not everybody is on the nicer HDR 800, 1000, etc. nit panels where you're able to get that higher level of brightness. So we'll see how well this ends up ultimately playing with the PC landscape. Again, I'm not sure how well this is all going to shake out, but if you've seen the presentations of Microsoft games running with this sort of pseudo HDR mode on games that do not typically support this, it makes a rather big difference to the overall image and the way that you perceive it. So potentially this is something that's going to be perhaps even a game changer for Microsoft, because them having this large backwards compatibility library puts them ahead of Sony, and it also means that that's an extra feature that gamers are getting that somebody in the Sony field is simply not going to get. Now, the other kind of interesting part here, when you take a look at it from the perspective that this is something that Microsoft is really pushing into basically everyone's machine out there, it means it has the potential to drive more HDR adoption across the board. And that potentially means nowadays that we could also start seeing shortages of HDR screens as well as HDR TVs, as people are going to be buying them up to continue getting the best image quality that they can get. Again, we'll see how this shakes out, and that's everything I got for you guys in this video. So check out the latest news updates that we'll be having in the next couple of days. I'll try and stay on top of this as much as possible. So until next time, it's been Crazy Welder, and I'll see you guys soon.